Good evening, everyone. It's a delight to have you here for yet another webinar in our IU webinar series on the futures of higher education. And today we have a real pleasure of hosting a focused debate on what the world can learn from higher education in Africa. And it is about time that we zoom in on the continent of Africa, as it is an incredibly important factor and indicator for the future also globally. Higher education enrollment in sub-Saharan Africa has more than doubled from 4 to 9% in recent years. Continuing this growth, continental enrollment in higher secondary and tertiary education is projected to double over the next 2 decades, from 103 million continental enrollments to 240. This rapid expansion is a leadership challenge unfolding alongside competing pressures to achieve national, regional, and global agendas. Leaders are tasked with navigating intensified competition for funding and sustainably future-proofing their institutions, all the while conceptualizing the best form of higher education in and for Africa. But herein lie opportunities. Across the continent, universities have been innovating in Africa under financial pressure, navigating massification, defending academic freedom. All these experimenting also with new epistemological and digital models. So these experiences are very, very precious, not just regional stories. They offer insights for global higher education systems facing their own crisis of cost, legitimacy, and relevance. And to talk about all this, we have a fantastic panel here today. It is wonderful to have our dear guests with us. And let me introduce you quickly to Paul Zilazar, former rector of the United States in Africa University in Nairobi, a wonderful friend of the International Association of Universities, and also a pillar in the IAU's executive leadership program. Then the IAU board member, Nana Amfo, who is also the vice chancellor of the University of Ghana, and Chris Brink, former Vice Chancellor of Stellenbosch University in South Africa, and then moved on to the continent in the UK, and then became the Vice Chancellor of the University of Newcastle. And it's also a huge pleasure to have the Chief of Higher Education sector of UNESCO, Noah Sobey, with us today, who will be coming to us with a few opening remarks to contextualize some of the projects that we have been involved in leadership over the last few months or so. Noah, it's a real pleasure to have you here. The floor is yours.
Oh, thanks very much, Andreas. So Noah Sobey, Chief of Section for Higher Education at UNESCO. Really glad to be with you today. The real show is coming right up, so I'll be very quick. One of the things we say at UNESCO with some frequency is that for higher education to be the transformative force in the world that we need it to be, higher education needs to be transformed. And I'll stand by that, but I will add that, transformation can both be a move towards a new innovation, and it can be the safeguarding and the recentering of a traditional intellectual virtue, traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge. Our topic, what the world can learn from African higher education, the answer is clearly lots. This is something that we recognize in all our programming at UNESCO. We have a major initiative that we call that's our Campus Africa flagship, which seeks to support the strengthening of higher education across the continent. I'm really pleased to have the chance to thank in virtual person the three speakers who recently contributed to a Campus Africa Leadership Laboratory that we organized with our good friends at the IAU last year, which represents exactly the spirit of our Campus Africa programming initiative, which insists that the future of African higher education be African-led and made in Africa. I'll just close by mentioning a new roadmap for transforming higher education that takes this spirit forward. It's a piece that we built out of the World Higher Education Conference process and dynamic, published it last month, Transforming Higher Education, Global Collaboration on Visioning and Action. And I will put a link in the chat, invite you to check it out, because I think it will deepen some of the conversations that you're about to have. But I'll stop with that and pass it back to you, Andreas.
Thank you, Noah, for these opening words. This is really sets us up wonderfully. Indeed, we had a fantastic experience in December last year working with our partners, UNESCO, on the Campus Africa Leadership Lab. And some of the findings at the time we would like to also convey to you today, indeed, with some of the facilitators who carried out the fantastic modules at the time. Which brings me directly to one of our speakers, Paul. We would be delighted if you maybe were to take on the first question that we have for you. Given the particular African context and your vast experience in straddling African higher education leadership positions, but also the US. How have African institutions, and from your point of view, defended academic freedom and institutional autonomy amid political, economic, and social pressures? In what ways, Paul, can we take lessons from what this offering of global context where academic freedom is eroding? So, what are the particular leadership skills that you have seen over your time in Africa that could be exportable also abroad?
First of all, thank you, and I wish to thank my fellow panelists and greet everybody wherever you are. So let me address that perhaps in three ways. One, some of the general points that one can make, and then secondly, a few examples, and then finally, what are the lessons? So in terms of general points, I think one of the most important developments across the continent has been, with regards to academic freedom, has been trying to develop collective defense and not individual heroism. African institutions have tried to protect academic freedom by sharing norms and mutual support systems, declarations, associations, cross-campus solidarity that outlast particular leaders or political moments. And then secondly, norm setting through scholarly networks. So Pan-African bodies have articulated academic freedom as both a right and a social responsibility, creating common language that universities can then invoke when governments or funders apply pressure. And then thirdly, trying to diffuse risk via cross-border collaboration. So continental research alliances, help to distribute people, data, and agendas across multiple countries and institutions, making it harder for any single state or state actor to isolate or silence contentious research. And then fourth, paying attention to public embeddedness as a form of protection. So when universities are visibly tied to public health, livelihoods, and problem solving, they build constituencies that raise the political cost of repression and strengthen claims to authority. And then obviously tied to this is having mission clarity as a way of resisting capture. Institutions with explicit civic or ethical missions make politicization more legible, more obvious, and therefore easier to contest than institutions with ambiguous or purely technocratic identities. And then finally, always tapping into your strategic memory and the repertoires of resistance. So past struggles, the anti-apartheid campus mobilization, provide and other protests across the continent over decades, provide proven tactics, coalitions, public campaigns, and transnational solidarity that can be adapted to new forms of, constraint. So these are some of the sort of strategies that come from the history of Africa trying to protect, African institutions trying to protect academic freedom. I'll just give you a few examples. The South African anti-apartheid university resistance, in the heydays of apartheid, in which campuses function as hubs for critical scholarship and student organizing, while faculty and students built coalitions with unions, churches, and civil society. These efforts also linked to international solidarity, including sanctions campaigns and academic boycotts and so on, shows you how, in a very difficult situation, the universities, not all of them, but many of them rose up. And then in terms of developing continent-wide agendas, Codesria has played a major role in coordinating African thinking on protecting academic freedom. So the 1990 Kampala Declaration and the 2025 Dar es Salaam Annex to that declaration, Codesria has helped turn academic freedom into an explicit continent-wide norm by pairing a rights-based statement, Kampala, with the updated contemporary threat map, Dar es Salaam. The Kampala Declaration, of course, frames intellectual freedom as part of wider human rights and democratization struggles. The Dar es Salaam Annex to the Kampala Declaration updates the Kampala Declaration for today's threat landscape, which includes shrinking civic space, political capture and marketization, neoliberal governance of universities, and so on. And then, of course, you also have organizations such as ARUA, the African Research Universities Alliance, which provides or has developed thematic multi-country research clusters on various areas, which helps to pool resources and distribute research work, reducing vulnerability of particular institutions and particular academics to retaliation and enhancing institutional bargaining. And then, of course, with regards to community-embedded activities, many of our universities, including the two vice chancellors who are here, have done that, making sure that they respond to important community or societal needs, which makes them valuable and visible in terms of their public value. And then, of course, mission-driven institutions such as Ashesi, very clear commitment to ethical leadership, civic responsibility, and so on and so forth. So what are the key lessons in conclusion? So the first lesson is build collective infrastructure before a crisis. Secondly, organize regionally to reduce isolation. And third, invest in public legitimacy, not just prestige. Universities that demonstrate tangible public benefit in terms of health, livelihoods, governance, you name it, cultivate constituencies that can raise the political cost of repression or budgetary punishment. And then, of course, make institution mission explicit and publicly accountable. Clear civic commitments make it harder for political actors to quietly redirect curricula, hiring or research priorities under the guise of reform or efficiency. And then, of course, use multi-scalar pressure. When autonomy is threatened, combine campus action with civil society alliances, and where appropriate, international academic solidarity to broaden scrutiny and leverage. And finally, treat academic freedom as dynamic work. It's never finished. New threats may arrive through new developments in society and so on. So these are some of the lessons I think the African landscape, higher education landscape, teaches us about academic freedom and institutional autonomy, as well as, of course, intellectual responsibility.
Thank you, Paul. When we spoke about this, I'll never forget that there are many, many of our colleagues in Africa who, given the recent attacks on academic freedom and institutional autonomy, specifically in the global north, have been saying, well, we have been toiling with exactly this issue for many, many, many decades. So our northern colleagues need to come to us, really, so we could share our mitigating strategies. This is a real asset, a real a wealth of experience that we have. Can you just, Paul, maybe from your own perspective, given your straddling leadership positions between the US and Africa, especially in your days in Nairobi, maybe just share some experience.
Yes, absolutely. So right now in the United States, as we all know, higher education is under enormous pressure from the state. It's also under enormous pressure from private capital, funders, donors, and so on, to follow certain directions. And many are truly baffled as to what they can do. And I think Africa does provide a roadmap to deal with some of these challenges, because we have had to deal with them for a very long time. One is to organize across the sector and not simply try to deal with these issues individually. And secondly, try to also organize internationally. The US is one country. How can you collaborate with colleagues elsewhere in North America, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, to lessen the cost and to raise the cost of being repressed, but also to create spaces for you to continue doing the kind of research that you might want to do. So, for example, issues of climate change, gender, and so on and so forth are no longer popular in this country. So if you want to continue doing that research, maybe you can collaborate with your colleagues in Canada, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, and so on, where those researchers, they're not facing the same kind of pressures. So really being mindful that the world is much larger than yourself, not only as an institution, but as a country, is one of the key lessons I think they can learn from our experiences on the continent, in which alternative intellectual spaces helped many of us, many of our academics, many of our institutions to resist pressure and survive, and in some cases even thrive.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Thank you. And next question that we have, and it, of course, is a very, very important one, and it's about epistemology. We have seen that, of course, over the many hundreds of years of history, of university history, of course, there's a canon of wisdom, a canon of knowledge that has developed over time. And now we see how this is playing out in the younger university traditions around the world, and especially in Africa. Nana, you have just recently spoken about it, if I believe it was yesterday or 2 days ago, when you had the induction into the Academy of Sciences in Ghana, which was a wonderful achievement. What does Africa's long engagement with multiple epistemologies teach the world about epistemological innovation and decolonizing curricula? Do we need to rethink notions of academic rigor in this regard? The floor is yours. Thank you, Nana.
Well, Andreas, thank you for that very loaded question. And I would say that is something that many African institutions are still working through it, right, in practice. Actually, this morning I was at an event on my campus, and a prayer was said at the start of the event, which is not unusual in our context. And the person who said the prayer moved seamlessly across 4 languages, and nobody found it unusual. It was completely natural. And I thought to myself that is a good illustration of how knowledge and meaning are actually produced in our context. Because Africa's engagement with multiple knowledge systems is not new. Long before Western science arrived through trade and colonization, African societies already had well-defined ways of knowing. Whether you are thinking about health, the environment, agriculture, social life, etc. But what colonialism did was not introduce knowledge, but rather reorder it, placing some forms above others. So when we talk about decolonizing curricula today, I think we have to go beyond the idea of simply adding indigenous knowledges into the syllabus. It's far more than that. Africa's experience suggests something which is more fundamental, that knowledge has always been plural, it's been situated, and it's been co-produced. So the real task is to reflect that reality in how we teach at our universities, how we research, and how we validate knowledge. So I can be concrete and give some examples. So for instance, growing up, many of us clean our teeth with charcoal, sometimes mixed with other natural ingredients. Now today you walk into a supermarket anywhere in the world and you can find activated charcoal toothpaste packaged and sold back to us as an invention. You know, I think about the skincare products that we used back then. We did so without thinking twice, you know, without glamorizing them. We used them because that was what our grandmothers and our mothers used. These are now repackaged and presented to us as organic products and sometimes at exorbitant prices. And we can say similar things about some herbal medicines, or even how communities read environmental signs, you know, like the direction of the clouds to anticipate rain. You know, they could tell if the clouds are in this direction, then it's going to rain. If it's in that direction, it's not going to rain. And they were quite accurate. Well, now we call that meteorology, right? So really, the point I'm driving here is not nostalgia, but it's that knowledge has always existed in different forms. And often one system validates it after the fact. And we can see that clearly in language. As I mentioned earlier, the moment this morning, you know, moving across 4 languages captures something fundamental. That in Ghana, in my country, like in many other African contexts, our everyday reality is multilingualism. You know, different languages, in our case, Akan, Ewe, Ga, and several others alongside English, which is our official language. You know, in classrooms and public life, people naturally move across languages, and knowledge is negotiated across these systems. No, yet many formal academic structures still assume that rigor requires a single standard language, for instance, or a single epistemology. But in practice, we know that this plurality actually allows for greater nuance and precision, and not less. And that reflects our reality. Linguistic or epistemic plurality cannot be noise. It can only be a resource. Now, I can bring in an example from agriculture because I think it's something that a lot of people can relate with. Now, long before formal agricultural extension systems, our farmers practiced mixed cropping, planting different crops together on the same land, right? So you have the cocoa and then you have the other crops. At some point, more formalized agricultural systems encourage monocropping in the name of efficiency. But interestingly, science has now come back to validate what farmers already knew. And mixed cropping improves soil fertility, especially when legumes are involved, because they fix nitrogen. It reduces pest outbreaks because pests find it harder to spread across diverse crops. And it improves moisture retention and resilience to climate variability. And in many cases, it stabilizes yields over time. So what we are seeing is not a replacement of indigenous knowledge by science, but a scientific validation of a system that is already working. We see similar dynamics in public health. You know, some of the most effective public health campaigns, think about HIV, AIDS, etc., in West Africa succeeded not because they were more technical, but because they spoke in ways that people understood through storytelling, performances, metaphor, using trusted community voices. Now, in that context, rigor is not just about getting the science right, that is important, but it's also about whether the message works. And maybe that is even more important. So I think the real question is not whether we include multiple knowledge systems, but rather whether we are willing to rethink what we mean by academic rigor. If we define rigor only in terms of abstraction, standardization, and distance from context, then much of what works in African settings will appear rather inadequate. But if we expand rigor to include context, responsiveness, and real-world impact, then we begin to see knowledge systems differently. So I sometimes think of it in three ways. That one, an analytical rigor, which we can all recognize. We don't have to talk much about it. But two, contextual rigor. Does it work in real settings? And three, relational rigor. Does it engage meaningfully with the people it is meant to serve? And so this links to the broader issue, and something which I've been reflecting on in terms of voice in the global knowledge system, whose knowledge is recognized as theory, whose knowledge travels, these were some of the things I was talking about on Thursday, and whose knowledge is cited, because often the issue is not the absence of these knowledges, but the recognition. And that's why we need to rethink the notions of rigor and talk more and more about these in our classrooms. So really, what does Africa offer the world here? I think it offers a simple but powerful lesson that the future of higher education is not about choosing between knowledge systems. It's about learning how to build them together, critically, productively, and without hierarchy. And when we do that, we don't weaken rigor. I would say that we actually deepen it.
Thank you, Nana, for these really, really insightful comments. Well, I was just listening to you, especially that last point, co-creation of knowledge and choosing different systems of knowledge. It brings us back to the whole idea of maybe epistemic culture, that we need to have a wider conception of what knowledge actually means, and especially also be a lot more aware. And you as a linguist are in the forefront of exactly that. You mentioned it up in the beginning with the exam, with your example this morning, and easily floating between 4 different languages, and having, of course, linguistic, how shall I say, anchoring of meaning within every language, and bringing that together in really then to have a more open idea of epistemic culture, so that we don't only stick to a very narrow conception of exactly that. Thank you so much. We'll move on. We're running out of time. We have so many interesting points here. So I'll quickly go back to Paul because I think what we can really learn from Africa is to do more with less. And given that that seems to be a global phenomenon at this stage, we would be very, very happy to hear from Paul some of the maybe technical aspects that you've come across in your time. So how have African experience with blended learning, Paul, digital leapfrogging perhaps, low bandwidth innovation, how might that guide other regions struggling to modernize their teaching and learning ecosystems? Paul. You're on mute, Paul. Paul?
Yeah, sorry for that. So I think, first of all, that the experience of Africa with technology and learning systems and so on is obviously not that different from other parts of the world, but there are contexts that vary, not only between Africa and other parts of the world, but also within Africa. 2 key moments, if one can use that word, have framed some of the debates and some of the initiatives. One is, of course, COVID-19, which, like all of us around the world, it forced institutions to adopt remote learning and scale it very, very quickly. So that I think, just like the rest of the world, for Africa was a turning point. And it of course revealed digital divides inside higher education systems, and it led leaders of African universities and faculty and others to really pay attention to this question of an equal access to devices, connectivity, data affordability, and home study environments, and so on and so forth. So issues of driving innovations like low bandwidth course design, asynchronous delivery, and alternative distribution models. And it also, I think, encouraged universities to work together nationally, regionally, and continentally. It accelerated system level coordination. So university associations and research and education networks mobilized the guidance and negotiated connectivity relief with companies, telecom companies, helping institutions move from ad hoc responses to coordinated sector approaches. And then in terms of blended learning, COVID-19 converted blended learning from an option into a mainstream institutional pathway. Many universities retained hybrid elements after reopening. So, the LMS, learning management system-based resources, online assessment components, virtual office hours, and so on, reframing blended learning as a resilience and access strategy rather than a niche modality. And then, of course, it influenced how people think about design. So you design for constraint, not design for the ideal user. Many African universities assume intermittent power, high data costs, shared devices, and uneven connectivity. So learning designs prioritize asynchronous engagement, downloadable resources, and lightweight content that still supports outcomes. And this also encouraged, I think, an attitude towards leapfrogging, seeing leapfrogging as institutional, not just technological. So successful digital leapfrogs pair technology adoption with changes in policy, pedagogy, assessment, staff workload, models, and student support, and so on and so forth. And then one fascinating thing which I experienced directly when I was Vice Chancellor was treating the mobile phone as a pedagogy tool, treating smartphones as the primary access device, which shifts choices toward micro content, compressed media, text forward resources, messaging-based support, and assessment designs that do not require continuous connectivity. And very importantly, open source ecosystems, really tapping into those to reduce cost and increase local control. And low bandwidth, as you noted, includes economic bandwidth. So investors innovated with data subsidies, zero-rated platforms, device lending, and offline distribution, and so on. And then the whole issue of hybrid delivery, expanding capacity faster than building campuses. So you're seeing a lot of those Odell models expanding, absorbing growing enrollments by reducing physical space constraints. And then, of course, regional collaboration, in terms of networks and consortia. The MasterCard Foundation, for example, established a consortium involving my university and 11 other universities to share in the development of faculty, online teaching expertise, and so on. So COVID-19 acted as a stress test that institutionalized digital delivery and led to very interesting and fascinating, initiatives with regards to devices, data affordability, staff training, quality assurance, and so on. And then the second is AI, which I will not spend too much time on, to note that AI has, just like elsewhere in the world, forced a lot of people to begin thinking very seriously about how we deal with AI in terms of our missions of teaching and learning, scholarship and research, operations and services, and of course external engagements and so on. Just to note on that the African universities are taking very interesting approaches to this. First of all, at the continental level, the AU has developed the continental artificial intelligence strategy, which was adopted in July 2024, which sets a number of priorities and ways of embedding AI in African economies, societies, and so on, including, of course, higher education. And then you are finding the development of regional AI strategies through regional associations. And then, of course, national AI strategies are proliferating and explicitly positioning universities as capability builders. And then you're getting regulators issuing higher education specific guidance for virtual learning and AI use. And universities themselves increasingly drafting institutional AI policies for learning and teaching, especially around generative AI. And universities are playing a very key role, academics and scholars, a key role in contributing to national AI policy development. And of course, AI affects many of our activities. So what are some of the key lessons? One is start with an offline first baseline. Build courses so students can complete core learning tasks with intermittent access. So, really how you design your technological infrastructure, bearing in mind some of the access issues. And regarding modernization, of systems as a change project in which multiple constituencies at the national level, institutional level, and regional level are involved, and make cost rather a design requirement, and use the use of open source and open standards to avoid lock-in into commercial platforms that obviously are interested in making a lot of money. And then, how you can use low-level technologies like the phone, and then scaling up in your technology, instructional technologies. And then, of course, looking at hybrid, teaching and learning blended as a capacity strategy. And of course, collaborating regionally to accelerate and de-risk transformation, and adopting AI and analytics responsibly and incrementally. And then, of course, measuring what matters, which, as my colleague, the VC of University of Ghana noted, is relationality, participation, equity, and learning outcomes. Thank you.
Excellent. If we quickly turn to your colleague in Ghana, Nana, just to add to Paul's very, very insightful, practical aspects of tuition, of imparting knowledge in Africa in various different ways, especially technical ones. How can African universities, or how have they managed to scale access under financial constraints? What models of low cost, high impactful higher education could inform global systems facing similar pressures, as we are here to learn from the African experience? Thank you. Nana.
Thank you, Andreas. Yeah, and I mean, I think that Paul has already, spoken to a number of the issues, particularly when it comes to digital learning. But I'll start by saying that African universities have not just expanded under constraint, they have innovated in response to it. And they have done so in ways that more resource systems are maybe now beginning to explore. And part of what is driving this is the demographics. As you know, Africa is the youngest continent. It has the youngest populations in the world. And with that comes a very strong and legitimate demand for higher education, not only as a public good, but also as a pathway to upward mobility, economic participation, and social transformation. So the pressure to expand access is real, it's immediate, and it's a societal need. And so highlighting a few ways in which, let me highlight a few ways in which institutions on the continent have responded. First, we have managed what many call, massification of higher education. So in countries like mine, in Ghana, in Kenya, etc., enrollment has expanded significantly, but public funding has not kept pace with that. And so universities have been forced to develop internal mechanisms to absorb this demand. So in a number of cases, you see multi-track systems. So you have regular streams, or what we call regular students, alongside fee-paying streams or fee-paying students, and which this allows institutions to expand access while maintaining some financial stability and therefore some standards, reasonable standards here. We also see when you get to the classrooms, you can sometimes see large lecture formats which are complemented by tutorial systems, by the use of tutorial assistants. And then there has also been an expansion in satellite campuses. And so that allows access, within the regions without students having to, travel from their home bases. And then also there's been the rise of distance education formats. Now, I mean, these are not perfect arrangements, but they demonstrate that the expansion has been, deliberate and pretty well managed. Now, the second area that I would like to speak to, which I think Paul has addressed quite extensively, is the use of blended and distributed learning. And that's an area where, constraints had really driven innovation, and COVID really, pushed us many years forward. So in institutions like the University of Ghana, we with the experience that we had from COVID, we've invested in ensuring that students can actually participate in digital learning and acquire digital skills. And so out of that, we instituted the One Student, One Laptop program. And that is intended to ensure that every student has access to a handheld device. We are not where we want to, but we have made significant progress in this regard. And beyond, the devices, the real innovation has been in how learning is developed. There's also, we try to promote asynchronous learning so that we don't absolutely rely on live lectures because of the issues with bandwidth, sometimes unreliable connectivity. So that content is made available in flexible formats. You can have your recorded lectures, you can download, the materials in your own time. And universities have also adapted in using, and which Paul mentioned, what I call lightweight, widely accessible tools, because people still use their mobile phones, as the only electronic device that they have. And I've seen, lecturers use platforms such as Telegram, even WhatsApp. So the lectures are uploaded. You can download them, listen to them in your own time. And then you can have discussions via, WhatsApp groups, Telegram, and so on and so forth. So for further engagement. Now, in many cases, these have proven more efficient than the heavier system designed for high bandwidth environment. So here again, context has to be taken into consideration. So really, sometimes innovation is driven by the infrastructural realities and not the ideal conditions. And a third dimension is how teaching itself is being rethought. So with our growing student numbers and limited faculty, universities are increasingly drawing on practitioners to co-teach. So this has a dual benefit. It brings industry experience directly into the classroom, and it helps to supplement teaching capacity. And we are seeing shifts also in assessments with the increasing use of computer-based examinations to manage skill more efficiently. Now, quickly, beyond the classrooms, also universities are building ecosystems that support education to livelihoods. So at the University of Ghana, I can give the example of the Student Venture Support Program, which supports students to translate ideas into viable enterprises. And we can also talk about initiatives such as the Kaboom project, which then links research, community engagement, and industry. So even as access expands, the focus is not only on enrollment, but on what students are able to do with the education. And I need to mention that scale is also being achieved through collaboration. Networks like ARUA, the African Research Universities Alliance, allow institutions to pool resources together. Collectiveness, it's very important. Co-supervise doctoral students and share expertise. So scale is not only about growing individual universities, it's about building collaborative systems of capacity. So very quickly, a few clear lessons for global systems now facing similar pressures. First, scale does not have to wait for perfect funding models. Second, innovation often comes from constraints and not surplus. And third, this is critical, that impact must be measured not only in terms of enrollment, but in whether higher education actually delivers on its promise of mobility, opportunity, and transformation. Because in the African context, this is what is ultimately at stake. So the broader question really is not simply how to do more with less, but how to design systems that are responsive to real societal demands, systems that are flexible, that are inclusive, and capable of translating access to meaningful outcomes. And I think that is where the global relevance lies. Thank you.
Nana, thank you so much. And it is a perfect conduit to our next questions. Really, you mentioned in your last third point, it really has to do about delivering on the promise of higher education. And the promise of higher education, the relevance of higher education really has to do a lot with its social relevance and its social role in the role of higher education, of course, in society. And for this, it gives me great pleasure to move towards Chris Brink, who has a dual hat, one of being the former Vice Chancellor of Stellenbosch University, a well-known university in South Africa, of course, and that of Newcastle in the UK. And there is probably no one out there who has thought more about not only what universities are good at, but what universities are good for. I just mention his book. There's a fade here. The Soul of a University: Why Excellence is Not Enough is one of how should I say, one of the cornerstones of thinking in higher education in exactly that regard. So, Chris, may I ask, in what ways does Africa's communitarian philosophy, it is always said that the individualistic North is countered by a more communitarian approach to higher education in Africa. How does this communitarian philosophy offer alternative approaches to public trust, very important, to legitimacy, and to the societal value of higher education? Chris, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas, and thank you for the free advertisement. Much appreciated. We've had so many specific examples now from Paul and Nana about what the world can learn from higher education in Africa. Let me, instead of trying to add to that list, let me try and make some general observations and then in response also to the question that you've just raised. So my first general comment would be about the matter of purpose. And as you said, I've long been asking these two questions, the juxtaposition of these two fundamental questions. The one question is, what are we good at? And we're very good in the global north in particular. We're very good as academics at explaining to the world what we are good at. But the second question is, what are we good for? And we're not quite so fluent, particularly in the global north, about explaining what we're good for. But there, I think Africa can and does take the lead, because there's more of an understanding in my experience, and I've been living back in Africa now for the past 10 years. There's more of a understanding of what is it that we are here to do. And it can't just be to produce more outputs. This, I often think that in sort of European, North American, Australasian universities, Canadian, so on, there's such a production line approach to just write more papers, make more publications. And I find that after a while, the means become the end in itself. And that, I think, is something that in Africa you don't have to the same extent. There's more of a search for a proper methodologically based response to the question, what are we here to do? And as you mentioned, much of that revolves around the notion of what are we here to contribute to society. So that's my first point, is what can the world learn from African higher education, a sense of purpose. The second point is to pick up on your distinction between communitarian, individualistic, sort of philosophical underpinnings. The global north higher education approach is there's still a reverence for what you might call the lone scholar model. And every academic will tell you about, Copernicus worked on his own, Galileo worked on his own, Newton worked on his own, Darwin worked on his own, Einstein worked on his own. And so you have almost the idea that the proper way to pursue scholarship is for the scholar to sit alone in their office and think great thoughts. That's the individualistic model. And I find, in my experience, in my view, there's a different approach in Africa where you understand that knowledge production is also a collective effort, and perhaps it is primarily a collective effort. Everybody knows the little saying that says it takes a village to raise a child, the African saying. And something like that pervades academia in Africa as well, that in as much as we honor and admire individual scholars, we also understand that the production of knowledge is a collective effort, and its knowledge comes out of the collective as much as, at least as much as, and perhaps more so than, out of the individual. So that would be my second point. My third point is one that's been implicit in much of what Paul and Nana have said, and it is the relationship between freedom and responsibility. And when Mandela became president in South Africa after the elections in 1994, the first three elections in South Africa, he stood up in Parliament and he said, the time has come for us to accept in our hearts and minds that with freedom comes responsibility. And that's a very old philosophical principle that you find in many sort of historical contexts in many places in the world. You can't have freedom without responsibility. You can't be responsible without freedom. And if that is true, if that is accepted as a general principle, then academic freedom is one species of freedom. It must apply to academic freedom as well. So, of course, we must strive for academic freedom. We must defend academic freedom and so on. But I would say that if you link freedom and responsibility, the promotion of academic freedom must also come with a promotion of academic responsibility. And not just at the individual level, and not just as a duty of some kind externally imposed, but as a freely chosen responsibility. And that would, in my view and in my way of arguing these issues, that must include the responsibility to society. So in my understanding, and I think this comes out in African thinking, the responsibility of a university is not just to generate new knowledge in the sense of producing more and more outputs. It is also the responsibility of the university to think about its role in society, again, the good for question. Paul mentioned the Kampala Declaration of 1990 on academic freedom. That was, I'm sure he will tell you because he was there. That was actually titled the Kampala Declaration on Academic Freedom and Social Responsibility. And in fact, the recent update last year in Dar es Salaam, which I read with great interest, if you read that document, you will find the word responsibility as often as you find the word freedom, academic freedom, social responsibility. Those go together. So that is something where I think the global north can learn a lot from African thinking, our role in society. The concept here in the southern part of Africa that's called Ubuntu, the idea that people are people through other people, and that pervades academic life as well. So those would be the three sort of general points that I would lift out. And as for the future, which I see we're running out of time, so that's probably the point to end on. What can we do better in African higher education? I think, given all the examples that Nana has mentioned about African epistemologies and so on, given all the examples that Paul have mentioned about innovation, technological and otherwise, I think we can do better at, as it were, broadcasting these innovations, broadcasting these different epistemologies, broadcasting the benefits that demonstrably have already been added to society by higher education in Africa. So I, as you know, Andreas, I'm one of those, I always make a plea for building at the university individually or on a regional basis or on a continental basis, building some kind of a repository of case studies that anybody, the public, the politicians, the press, anybody can go to when we say we bring benefit to society and they say, can you give me some examples? It would be wonderful if there's a repository of such case studies that anybody could go and refer to. So I'm sure there's much more to be said, but you warned us at the outset that we only have an hour, and I see the hour is about up, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. But I won't let you go before you also maybe go into what you think is Africa in terms of a laboratory, the future. We know that you have said, Paul have said it, Nana has said it, that all the SDGs, all the issues, the challenges that the international community have defined are present in Africa. Maybe can you just expand a little bit on that and what that is of relevance to higher education in Africa, and especially as a model also of teaching to the rest of the world?
Well, I think the points have already been made, but let me try to summarize. The first is the demographic fact, the youngest population in the world. So here is a growth curve, a demographic growth curve that sort of outstrips the rest of the world. And these young people very, very properly will demand a proper education. So there's the issues of scaling, there's the issues of technology. What I would add to those is the question of purpose. You know, what kind of an education do we want these young people to have? And how does that, as it were, set the pace and set the example for the rest of the world? So I think it's quite right to think of Africa as a sort of living laboratory for what is going to happen in future. No disrespect, of course, to what is happening in the rest of the world, but the opportunities, the enthusiasm, the new ways of thinking, the innovation, and so on, there's a lot that if we look around what is happening in Africa now, that we can extrapolate and turn that into benefit for global higher education.
Chris, indeed, thank you so much. We are coming to the end of this webinar, unfortunately, and there's a lot more to be said, and we would love to hear also many more of the voices that of the people that have tuned in, and we thank them for tuning in. Indeed, this has been the IAU webinar on what we can learn from Africa in terms of higher education, in terms of the lessons, and I think there's a lot to be heard and a lot that we can take away. Chris, you just mentioned the laboratory of the world. Indeed, let's zoom in on, be a lot more attentive to what is going on in Africa, because it is the future. With these words, I really thank you for having tuned in, Nana, Paul, and Chris, and please tune in to our next episode in the IAU webinar series on the future of higher education. Thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you. Bye.